Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Nearly a quarter of a century ago, India declared itself a nuclear power. On May 11th and May 13th of 1998, India conducted a series of 5 nuclear tests and demonstrated its capability to threaten unacceptable damage towards its adversaries. 25 years since these tests, India has come a long way. India's nuclear warheads have reached triple-digit numbers, and India has accumulated a sizable arsenal to deliver these warheads. To talk about India's nuclear journey on this 21st anniversary of nuclearization, I have with me Saurabh Todi, who is a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution and a fellow nuclear weapons enthusiast. Welcome, Saurabh.
Thank you, Pranav. Happy to be here.
Yes, we've talked about nuclear weapons a lot on this podcast, including you and I have spoken about North Korea's nuclearization. But India's journey is quite unique because the first nuclear explosion test that was conducted in May 1974 made many people believe that India would soon weaponize. But this did not happen. We had what is long described as India's nuclear odyssey towards overt nuclearization. So what is the significance of India being the nuclear power? And why do you think that especially the nuclear tests are not only are very emotional in the national sentiment, but also historically important in terms of international politics?
You're right. I mean, you see, we had the peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974, and then there was this expectation that once we have the technology now, we will soon weaponize it. But that didn't happen. It was not until Rajiv Gandhi, decided that, now we will weaponize the technology in a way that can be delivered in warheads. So, I mean, it is quite significant because as you would know, there is this treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has almost near universal membership. Only, I think, a few countries who are not members, which includes Israel, India, Pakistan, and now North Korea, South Sudan, I think. And the idea is that, India is one of the very few countries which have not signed onto the agreement and has also shown that it is the power it is a nation that has the technology to conduct nuclear tests and to weaponize it. And development of nuclear weapons very publicly has not really caused it any damage. If you see the transition, we can discuss it later, but the sea change in global perception and how the reaction to India's tests were, in next few months of the test and then in a few years later, there's been a huge difference. India's status as a nuclear power has been normalized and there's no discussion anywhere really anymore that, no calls for India to junk its nuclear weapons program, no calls for India to, denuclearize. So that in itself is a very, very big signal.
Yeah, you're right. Because we did face a minor series of sanctions, but because of some really good diplomacy, we were able to undo those sanctions within a period of, I think, 3 years, right?
I think our tests were in 1998, and I think by 2000, one or two, I think by 2001, when Bill Clinton visited India in, 2000, and that was itself signal that, US was not looking to punish India for too long. And then after that, things changed
that's right.
dramatically.
And so what else makes this significant? I think what we can talk about is also some of the myths that have built around in public. Saurabh, you have experienced this firsthand where the myth-making of India's nuclear bomb is quite out there. That people, even today in the popular perception, India's nuclear bomb has myths around it. Can you tell us what those myths are that you've experienced firsthand talking to colleagues and talking to peers in other countries?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest, the idea that, India conducted nuclear tests itself, has been a bit jarring for at least the nuclear weapons and nuclear non-proliferation community, right? Because it is a big deal that India did conduct these tests. But what has been also unique is that, these different, reasonings that have been there, why did India choose to conduct a test in 1998. And one of the most common, I think, this argument is that, this is what the community calls the Hindu bomb. The idea that the fact that the tests were conducted under the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government, who is the member of who represents the BJP, which is described, like a Hindu party. It is because of, that the party trying to portray this bomb as, like this some sort of a Hindu renaissance. I don't think it's true. I mean, you know the history. I mean, what is the history behind it and why it is really not a Hindu bomb?
Yeah, that's true. And it's not a Hindu bomb, firstly, because making a nuclear bomb is extremely difficult. Firstly, you need all the fissile material production sites in place several years beforehand. So the decision to, produce plutonium and enrich uranium, on the other hand, both these require large amounts of investment. And these investments, as you know, were made far back as the 1960s, when India procured several research reactors and fast breeder reactors that were able to churn out a large amounts of uranium and plutonium. So the decision to place these was made quite a long time ago, both during the Nehru era as well as the Indira Gandhi era. And this was considered to be India's ambivalence with nuclear weapons, because it had a significant amount of latency, what we call as the ability to build the bomb, but it doesn't build the bomb. And it did not weaponize for quite unknown reasons. Even today, it is historically contested that India did not face really much of a threat from China. And India did not see the Chinese nuclear arsenal, which was extremely small. It was in double digits back in the 1970s and 80s. And it was generally considered that India did not face a nuclear threat from China. Therefore, India did not nuclearize. But however, in the 1980s, in the mid to late 1980s, when Pakistan began assembling its nuclear bomb, and by assembling, I mean to say putting in all the material to weaponize it, testing the plastic explosives and so on, the Rajiv Gandhi administration in mid to late 1998 became quite worried. And
I think it's 1988.
Yes, 1988, they got quite worried. And during that time, Rajiv Gandhi personally gave the go-ahead for scientists to begin weaponization. And by weaponization, what we mean is the production of the warhead and the integration of these warheads into delivery vehicles. And the only delivery vehicle at that time was the Jaguar. So you had gravity bombs that had to be designed and produced, and that could be integrated to the Jaguar fighter bomber that we had, the ground attack aircraft that we had. So this was the first step towards weaponization in between 1988 and 1989. And then in 1995, India was negotiating the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in the Conference on Disarmament. And it was in India's interest to pursue our Test Ban Treaty because the superpowers of the world had continued to test these weapons. So much so that France conducted its last test somewhere around 1994 or 1995. And despite international protests, especially France, conducted its test till the very last day of beginning negotiations. And India thought that it would be locked out. India already had a nuclear weapons capability and it wanted to test it. So in December 1995, under the P.V. Narasimha Rao administration, India decided to prepare for these tests in the Thar Desert, same as in Pokhran. But the CIA satellites caught them. The Clinton administration said the images retrieved from the satellite were quote-unquote clear as mud, that India was going to conduct nuclear tests. And the information was actually leaked to the New York Times. And in the UN and in the Conference on Disarmament, this piece of information that was publicized in the New York Times was made widely popular. And during the CTBT negotiations itself, India was criticized for trying to hurt the negotiations process. And this is where really the push to test once again came about, especially from the scientific community, because the scientific community was clearly worried about the reliability of these weapons. The US and the Soviet Union had conducted hundreds of tests. We're not talking about dozens, we're talking about hundreds of tests, right? And clearly they had an up advantage that they had so much data that they could also use supercomputers to continue simulating nuclear tests and improving their warheads. But India did not have that privilege. So really, India was forced to conduct these tests in 1998. And in a way, the Vajpayee government had a greater sense of resolve after having learned from the mistakes of conducting tests in 1995. And therefore, in May 1995, just after India rejected the CTBT, did we proceed to conduct the tests. And there is a documented evidence to show that this is not a Hindu bomb, but there was, in fact, even during the Deve Gowda administration, which lasted for a very short period, Prime Minister Deve Gowda played a very important role in keeping India away from signing the CTBT. So it's a decision that was taken across administration. There is a strong sense of a strategic culture involved in the leadership as well, who were quite ambivalent about India's nuclearization. And all things point to the fact that it was systematic international pressures that led to these tests.
Yeah, and I mean, I was also wondering, I think this idea, like to call it like a Hindu bomb is to just, hide, all these factors that, that you just listed. I mean, also, we should not forget that the indefinite extension of the NPT in, I think, 1995, where, the idea was, the NPT was first supposed to be, renegotiated after 25 years. But the fact that, it was extended, as is, also closed the door for, India to be admitted into the NPT as a weapon state, because it did conduct a test in 1974, right? So that plus the pressure to sign CTBT and the fact that, the world was also in a unipolar movement after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, all of these factors, they all combine into something which, and plus, even the BJP mentioned explicitly in their manifesto that they would test. So I think this resolve was there. And as you said, that multiple governments across party lines over the years have made sure that, there was enough funding for these projects. There were enough backing at the highest level for these projects. So just to, kind of label this as a Hindu bomb, does really disservice to the deep strategic culture and then the strategic necessity that led to having these weapons. And also, the letter which was sent to, I think, Clinton to argue that, why India did the test. And there was this slight mention of China, which shows, we had anxiety. But also, I think, moving forward, you also see, the remarkable progress that India did in terms, because right after the test, there were sanctions, on India. Then obviously, Pakistan also tested a few days later. So that is a separate issue which we'll handle later. But the fact is, after these tests by both India and Pakistan, there were huge sanctions on India. There was condemnation across. But all of this lasted less than a year or two.
Yes,
and after that, sorry?
Yeah, that's right. It lasted for 2 years.
Yeah. And then what happened was, this rapid kind of acceptance of the fact that, India is a country with nuclear weapons. It is also a country which is very important at a global stage. And then you see, this intense back channel between the George Bush administration and the Vajpayee government on how to bring the India-US relationship back on track and to, completely transform it, under the India-US civil nuclear deal. So how do you see that? Do you think that that deal was the last nail in the coffin of any even just any effort, even however remote it is, for the global community or at least the West to argue for denuclearization of India?
Thank you for listening to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short break.
You spoke about the NPT indefinite extension in 1995. So there was a NPT extension kept happening on a rolling basis where in every NPT review conference, they would extend it for the next 5 years. And in 1995, it was the 25th anniversary of the NPT, and therefore they wanted to do something significant. And there were 3 different options presented, that there was going to be a rolling extension where you would roll it for every 5 years and you would renegotiate it. You would renegotiate the terms of extension. The second option was to extend it for a period of 10 more years. And then there was another option where you would press for disarmament commitments. So a lot of the non-nuclear weapon states were really pressing the chairperson of the NPT RevCon to press for greater accountability from the nuclear weapon states, the P5 countries. And eventually, particularly the United States, it's used its soft power and sort of arm twisting power and its power to network with other countries to really force an indefinite extension of the NPT. This is a very well documented. There's a very nice book by Stanford University Press, which it meticulously documents the 1995 NPT REFCON. So the final nail in the coffin was the permanent extension, which was supported all by the other Western member states, and there was really no consideration given to holding the existing nuclear powers to be held accountable. So that too was the nail in the coffin, I would say. And I think it was very clear that India as a nuclear power could never be accepted. The only way of acceptance was calling it India a responsible nuclear power. So this phrase of a responsible nuclear power was between 2004 and 2008 and 9 was extremely important, because that acknowledgement that India was responsible, that the civilian authority had control over the military, and India did not make overt nuclear threats. These factors became extremely important in providing some form of a de facto recognition. But of course, the sentiments in the past 25 years have changed. The signing of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, or the Nuclear Ban Treaty, demonstrates that there is immense dissatisfaction among the non-nuclear weapon states in the way the P5 have behaved, in the way they have continued to increase their arsenals. Quite interestingly, when India was negotiating the CTBT, one of the clauses that it wanted to include was a 10-year time frame for gradual disarmament. When Ambassador Arundhati Ghosh was the permanent representative, she tried to ensure that this clause was included, because you could not have disarmament removed from nuclear testing, right? Once you stop testing, the next process is to continue to disarm your warheads. Unfortunately, this clause became extremely contentious, and India could just not accept it. And politically, India was now not ready to accept terms without disarmament. So eventually, the signing of the CTBT and the NPT extension really made sure that India had no way into the nuclear club.
But I mean, that's more from the India side, right? That there's no way that India would now disarm or at least denuclearize. But I was thinking more in the terms of the Western perception. Is that the fact, when the US-India relationship normalized, and then after this, the civil India nuclear deal in 2008 and the NSG exemption, I mean, that essentially makes India a de facto nuclear power. I mean, obviously, it's not one under the NPT, but I think this kind of ended any hopes at all, how much ever cosmetic those hopes might be, on the fact that, there will be some expectation that India might, or at least, would you say that even countries have even stopped, even bringing them up in any kind of a conversation?
I think India is still brought up in conversations. South Asia's nuclearization is still considered to be quite a hot topic. But I think if you, in relative terms, you could say that India is not mentioned very often. But relative to Israel, which is also a non-signatory to the NPT, which also covertly nuclearized, it has still not declared itself a nuclear power. The mention of Israel is far, far more sparse than what India's status.
But it's also because, I mean that's true. But I mean, the fact that Israel has not announced that it is, or it does have nuclear weapons, makes it less likely to at least be that much in conversation, because there's always this plausible deniability. So in that way, I think India, it's out in the open, and I think with the India-Pakistan dynamic, I think makes it a lot more the topic of conversation, especially when the leaders in Pakistan do brandish this threat of nukes every now and then. So that kind of makes the equation it seem more risky.
Yeah, that's true. It's quite amazing that even in disarmament conversations, what disappoints me is that even in disarmament conversations, it's quite difficult for other countries to acknowledge that in this history of disarmament, there was India and Pakistan collectively had to fight what was essentially exclusion of security. The superpowers could not ensure that these countries remained more or less secure, and they could not guarantee their security. And even in disarmament conversations, this history is quite brushed aside, which is also one of the negativities of being accepted nuclear power, right? Because your history of nuclearization, the path that you took from the P5 was quite different. So that history is brushed aside, and you are included within the club of all nuclear-powered countries. So those are some of the disadvantages of not being mentioned.
True. And I mean, also, I think the concerns that, India, I mean, now after 25 years, it is common knowledge, and, people would not dispute the fact that, India had to nuclearize, and we did carried out those tests in 1998. But at that time, even, among experts, the idea is still that, India maybe could have been okay without having nukes. But personally, I think that argument does not hold that much water, because the threat that India faces, especially, in a contested neighborhood with China looming, I think having the security of nuclear weapons is something very important. And especially, as you said, India is one of the most responsible nuclear states as well. We have the no first use, and leaders, almost no one really, makes any outlandish statements regarding nukes. And that sense of responsibility has really allowed India to, be taken seriously. And all of these kind of exemptions for India, sail through, because the global community, I don't know who said this, but the global community does not lose its sleep that India has nukes.
That's a
lose sleep that North Korea has nukes, or Iran may get nukes, or Pakistan maybe has nukes and it may be unstable, but no one loses sleep that India has nukes and that are at risk. So that just shows that how much of maturity India as a nation, as a responsible nuclear power, has shown.
Yeah, that's true. And speaking of the threats that India faces, Saurabh, what would you say that in 25 years, how much has the threat to India has evolved? Because especially there is conversation about change in China's nuclear posture. And how do you think India's nuclear arsenal has behaved, and how India as a state has responded to these threats in the past 25 years? Could you talk about that?
I think, at least in terms of, the India's nuclear deterrent, now we have a tried. It is a far, a much more different, much better situation from 1990s, as you said. At that time, we only had air-delivered weapons. So we only had to use Jaguars. But now, obviously, we have the Arihant, we have Agni series of missiles, and then we obviously have jets. Rumored, or it is assumed that even Rafales could be used for nuclear delivery purpose. So now we have a tried. In that way, I think we are more secure. We have a much more resilient second strike capability. Obviously, it has to become better. We are now developing submarine-launched terroristic missiles, which would further increase the quality of India's deterrent. And I think, thanks to the Indian missile program, now we have a variety of missiles of a variety of ranges which can be deployed for this purpose. And I think even the regional context has also changed. So Pakistan has developed short range nuclear weapons, especially tactical nukes, which India has refrained from developing. But that creates an issue. And then I think one thing to look forward to, or at least be mindful of, is that as China's nuclear posture evolves vis-a-vis the US, how would India respond? India would have to respond. We still, I think, are committed to the credible minimum deterrence policy. But if the ballistic missile defense systems developed further by China, and then the number of warheads, ICBMs also increase dramatically, India may have to, respond in a way to offset that kind of emerging asymmetry.
Yeah, that's true. I would add a couple of other things. I think firstly, remarkably, in 25 years, I think it's only in 2020 that India actually fulfilled what its doctrine actually stated, that a functioning triad.
Yeah.
So when we had the Arihant submarine, when the Arihant submarine went on active patrol, is when the triad actually came alive. That it took quite a while to even assemble that level of arsenal. And I think the credible minimum deterrence could be contested, because what is a minimum deterrence is a number that's quite arbitrary. A minimum deterrence for Pakistan might not be the same minimum deterrence that we might require for China. So those are some of the academic debates that sort of take up the nuclear debates. I think on the other hand, soon after the nuclear tests, the administration, the Vajpayee government, decided to pursue a ballistic missile defense system. So early on, the decision was taken that we'll have a national defense system to protect the national capital, and eventually we will have protect other cities. So India's pursuit of BMD is still one of the most sort of puzzles that is still not resolved by scholars, because on one hand, missile defenses have very specific purposes, especially from the US nuclear experience. We know that BMDs are actually for damage limitation. You want to minimize the damage on your own country so that you're able to survive and continue operation. But on the other hand, India promises mutually unacceptable damage. That is, that if India is attacked, it will also launch it. But there's no clear purpose on what India's missile defense is meant for. If India wants to achieve second strike capability, then wouldn't it be better to protect, say, its nuclear arsenal rather than cities? And especially given that cities are quite difficult to protect. So these are some of the inconsistencies in India's VMD program. From what I have heard and what I've read, scholars think that India is doing technological hedging, that it is assembling VMD technology so that one day when the technology is mature enough, India is not left behind the race. So India doesn't want China to have a VMD system, US to have a VMD system, Russia to have a VMD system, but India is left behind because it never pursued this technology. So those are some of the puzzles that I see, and I think in the next 25 years, we might see the arsenal build up, or we might see the arsenal, for example, stagnate with, let's say, a 200 warhead or a 300 warhead. But I don't think reductions would necessarily be a goal in the 25 years.
Not true. I mean, especially, as you see, the global geopolitical situation is evolving. So there seems to be more anxiety among countries. You have, concerns in many countries. You had like a recent kind of a debate in South Korea whether they should acquire nukes or not. So countries are anyway becoming more, anxious. And that is not a recipe for any sort of, at least arms reduction. I mean, if we get into arms control, that by itself would be like a win. But even that seems a bit unlikely. And I would say, I think one last thing, which I think we haven't touched on, is the fact that the role of nuclear energy, So that is something, India is focusing a lot on. It is now building around 10 nuclear reactors on a fleet mode and hoping to commission a new reactor every year, I think starting next year. And then obviously, given its green targets and now higher focus on trying to reform the Indian nuclear industry, there are reports that, they may go for a further opening up of the nuclear power sector to private companies. Shows that, India is now looking at nuclear energy as well as a reliable source of non-fossil fuel energy.
Yeah, I have read less about nuclear energy, and you've written quite a lot about this. So I do not have any opinions on that. We have a lot more to cover, but of course, because of the limited time, we'll have to end the podcast. But it's been wonderful talking to you, Saurabh, about nuclear weapons. We have conversations outside the podcast, and we have more conversation within podcast itself. And it's always great to talk about how nuclear politics shapes the world in quite unique ways. Thank you very much for joining me, and thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
Thank you, Pranav.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.